As usual, we're all gathered here today to listen to another exposition of the Lord Buddha's teaching. Before we commence today's sermon, let us all take a moment to remind ourselves of how extremely fortunate we are to be born, be present in an era in which the Buddha's teaching prevails in its most pristine condition, available for us to understand, to comprehend, the only medicine there is for the soul, the only path there is to our liberation, the only path there is to our purification. Let us remind ourselves that we are able today to be students of this because of He, the Great Master, the Perfect One, the Omniscient One, the Infinitely Compassionate One, the Most Admirable One, the Unvanquished One, the Undefeated One, the Miraculous One, the Sublime One, the Blessed One. Let us take a solemn vow to be His lifelong disciples. This is for no other reason than having seen His teaching, than having understood the essence of His teaching, and having realized that no other path remains to our satisfaction, our happiness, our bliss, than the path that He expounded, He taught, and He made available for all of us. So to take this oath, let us all be upstanding and recite the Dhirasya Vigata Mohasya stanzas, of which you'll all know 3 by now. 2 of them most of you will know of by heart, and the 3rd one was introduced last week. So let us recite these stanzas, and as we do so, I urge you to remind yourselves to contemplate on how fortunate we are to be students of such a great master, of such a great teacher. Dhirasya vigata mohasya abhinna khilasya vijita vijayasya anighasya susamachittasya buddhasilasya sadhupanyasya vesantarasya vimalasya bhagavato tasya savako hamasmi akatankatisya tusitasya vantalokamisasya muditasya katasamanasya manujasya antima sarirasya narasya anopamasya virajasya bhagavato tasya savako hamasmi asansayasya kulasya venaikasya sarati varasya anuttarasya ruchira dhammasya nikhankasya abhasakarasya manachidasya virasya bhagavato tasya savako hamasmi asansayasya kulasya venaikasya sarati varasya anuttarasya ruchira dhammassa nikkankassa pabhasakarassa manachidassa virassa bhagavato tassa savako hamasmi. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Excuse me. And to now seek refuge in the Noble Triple Gem, and to observe the precepts before we commence today's proceedings. Please repeat all together and after me. Buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dutiyampi buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dutiyampi dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Dutiyampi sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi buddhaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi dhammaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Tatiyampi sanghaṃ saraṇaṃ gacchāmi, Saranāgamanaṃ sampunnaṃ, Pānātipātā veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyāmi. Adinnādāna veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyāmi. Kāmesu Micchāchārā veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyāmi. Musāvādā veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyāmi. Suramēraya majjapamā datthāna veramani sikkhapadang samadhiyāmi. Tisaranena saddhiṃ pañcasīlaṃ dhammaṃ sādhukaṃ surakkhitāṃ kattvā appamādena sampādeta. Okay, you may all now be seated. Before we continue with today's sermon, let us also take a moment to invite all celestial beings, wherever they may be in these 10,000 world systems, if they have the slightest chance, the slightest opportunity of joining us such that they are able to witness this meritorious deed as it unfolds, and they're able to listen to the teaching of the Buddha, which will eventually help them to attain ultimate happiness. May they all join us. Let us remind ourselves that these beings that we talk of are none other than those who have been mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters to us, those who have been family to us, friends, those who helped us in our difficult times, those who pulled us out of the lurch, helped us stand up on our own 2 feet, guided us, sheltered us, fed us, looked after us. When the various vicissitudes of life came to us, these are the beings in the countless births in samsara who were there to help us, support us, assist us. So therefore it goes without saying then that it is our duty and our obligation to help them at a time when we have the upper hand. So let us take this moment to extend the opportunity to listen to the teaching of the Buddha, the most perfect thing there is in this world, the only path there is to salvation. Let us extend a helping hand to all of them. Let us offer them this opportunity to witness the meritorious deed and rejoice in these merits. Among them may be those who have been born in woeful plains. May they witness this meritorious deed, rejoice in the merits, and redeem themselves from such woeful plains and be born in the blissful plane. And for all sentient beings in the blissful plane, may they be fortunate enough to listen and understand and comprehend this teaching. May this teaching help them to free themselves once and for all from suffering, and may they all be able to attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. So with that hope and compassion towards them, with gratitude from the bottom of your heart, as I now make this invitation, I ask you all to extend this invitation out to all of them, to join us, to witness this meritorious deed, to rejoice in them, to listen to the teaching, and to attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Samanta Chakravalesu Atra Gacchantu Devata Saddhammang Munirajassa Sunantu Sagga Mokkadam Dhammasavana Kalo Ayang Bhadanta Dhammasavana Kalo Ayang Bhadanta Dhammasavana Kalo Ayang Bhadanta. Also, before we commence, let us all take a moment to remind ourselves that although we may be kind, generous, helpful beings that we are today, this is thanks to the noble association that we are fortunate enough to receive today. In this countless, endless journey in samsara, a journey where we can see no beginning, we have virtually always been in the association of ignoble and immoral people. Associations which defiled our minds with raga, dvesha, moha, desire, aversion and delusion. And having been blinded with ignorance and tainted with attachment countless times, to achieve that which we desired, we will have offended, desecrated, reviled, insulted the noble ones, the noble triple gem, as well as the Aryans. The consequences of such actions may be that today, no matter how hard we try to make efforts to make progress in the teaching, in the path to achieve our liberation, having offended such sublime qualities and virtues, it becomes extremely difficult for us to instill those virtues within us, within our minds. So, before we begin today's sermon, realizing the errors in our ways of the past, let us all take a moment to seek the forgiveness from the Noble Ones for any thoughts, words or actions of offense, insult, revile and desecration we might have directed towards the Noble Triple Gem, the Samma Sambuddhas, Pacceka Buddhas, Arahata Buddhas, Anagamis, Sakridagamis, Sotapannas, be they on the path of having attained the fruits, as well as the Buddha's ministry, the Sambuddha Shasana. May we be forgiven. So let us take a moment to seek that forgiveness, and as you do so, I remind you, I urge you to make a promise to yourself to never find yourselves in such situations again. Okay. And finally, before we begin, let us make a firm resolve, may through the course of this sermon, if there have thus far remained gaps in my understanding, gaps in my knowledge, gaps in my comprehension, which have kept me from freeing myself, embarking on the journey to my own freedom, may those gaps be fulfilled, and may I be able to achieve the noble state of Sotapanna. And for any among you who may have already achieved that state, may through the course of this sermon you be able to fulfill the subsequent stages, and may we all be able to attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. With that firm resolve in mind, I invite you to prepare yourselves to listen to this sermon. Okay. Day by day, you must begin to see the rewards of your journey on the noble path. The beauty of this is that you can't walk this path blindfolded. It is probably the only path you can't walk that way. Any other path, someone could blindfold you, hold your hand and walk the path along with you. All you got to do is follow the tug. If you feel you're being tugged left, then step left. If you feel you're being tugged right, step right. If you feel you're being tugged forward, so on and so forth. Any other path you could walk like that. You do remember playing games as a young child. Blindfolded, walking about. Especially if you remember playing games in the New Year festivities. what you call the customary kanamuttiya bindima. So you're blindfolded, stick in hand, and you start wavering about, and you step to the sound of the cheers of others. There's no guarantee that they're always genuine. Oftentimes you're misguided. Sometimes you'll hear voices from both camps. That's when it's really confusing, right? Some will say step left, others will say go right. Which way do you go now? So that's why it's called a game. The trick there is to hit the prize out of sheer luck. There is some guidance, but there is no guarantee that that guidance is genuine or that you can trust that advice. Now, unfortunately, or I suppose fortunately, depends how you look at it, it's a very different concept that applies on your path to your liberation. The noble path cannot be walked based on the cheers of others if you are blindfolded. As a matter of fact, your blindfold comes off the moment you step onto the Noble Eightfold Path, the noble path to liberation. That is the first time ever in samsara your blindfold comes off. Every other path, every other track you walk on, you've always got a blindfold on. But one fine day that blindfold comes off. That's this very same day. That coincides with you stepping on the path for the first time. You must be able to relate to this. Even those among you who have not walked the path yet, or who have not stepped on the path yet. We've spoken about a lot of this in the past, but I'll remind you. You know for a fact that none of you came into life with a plan. You came in with an expectation, but not a plan. Your expectation was to achieve satisfaction, happiness, fulfillment, contentment. But you didn't have a plan, did you? So what did we do? When you don't have something, you look around to see if others do. If someone's got something you don't have, then the good among us, now it's best to borrow. So we borrowed what we didn't have from somebody else. In this case, you borrowed a plan. Please may I have your plan? Every walk or every step you took in life, every turn you took on this twisted road, you borrowed somebody's plan. From the day you can remember, from the day you learned to talk, from the day you were able to take guidance either verbally or visually, you start to borrow other people's plans. Usually the two people you first borrow plans from are called mother and father. Then you start borrowing other people's plans. More and more plans you keep borrowing from people. You borrow plans from your siblings. You borrow plans from your teachers. These are plans that usually they are executing if they are genuine, if they are faithful to you, if they wish you good, then they will share with you the plan that they're on. Or if they're not faithful to you, if they're not forthright with you, then they'll probably share a plan with you which they have themselves discarded. which a plan that they consider rubbish, they'll quite easily throw it at you and say all sorts of wonderful things about it, hype it up, and then before you know it, you're on it. That's the problem. When you don't have a plan, you're working to someone else's plan. This is true in all cases in life, both in a very worldly sense as well as a supramundane sense. Your plan to liberation must be the steps of the Noble Eightfold Path. See, you are handed this plan by someone who is a member of the Aryan Club. We've spoken about this in the past. You become a member of the Aryan Club once you've gotten yourself a copy of the plan. Until such time, you are running a borrowed plan. This is not new to you. You have plenty of experience running other people's plans. That is why you're exhausted. Show me one person who is content. Not two, we haven't got time for two. Show me one person who is content, who is fulfilled, who can happily say, walk this plan, walk this path, and you shall be happy forever. Do you know a doctor who's got a plan to fulfillment, to contentment? Do you know an engineer who's got a plan to fulfillment and contentment? Do you know a teacher who's got a plan to fulfillment and contentment? Or a king or an emperor? Do you? Do you know a mother or a father who's got a plan to contentment or fulfillment? Do you know anyone who's got a plan to contentment and fulfillment? They'll all have a plan. It's just not a plan that gets them to their expectation. We all came here with an expectation. That I think you'll agree. Seeing light for the first time, opening your eyes for the first time, beginning to sense your presence in this world for the first time, you had an expectation, and that expectation was an unsatisfied urge. Something not quite right, that you always tried to put right. That was always there, wasn't it? You could never define it, you could never put your finger on it, but something was never quite right. When you realized that was when you opened your eyes, so that you could put things right. You will all be able to sense the depth of these words to the level you have understood the Dhamma. So that is, after all, up to each and every one of you. I'll say what I have to say. You will understand these words and the depth that they contain depending on your understanding, your comprehension of the Dhamma. So I'm going to leave that bit to you. When you came into this world, something wasn't quite right. What was it? That's a difficult one. That's a tough one. You were never quite able to figure that out, but you knew that something wasn't right. So you opened your eyes. Literally, you opened your eyes for the first time. You turned your eyeballs left, right, in a frenzy, swirling them round, turning your eyes as far as your eyes could, trying to take in the sights that came flooding through your eyeballs, as wide an angle as possible. You want to take in maximum depth. Remember? And then you realize it still wasn't right. But you never gave up. But you were also then presented with another option, your ears. So you opened your ears and you started to listen. Sounds came flooding through your ears. All this while you're trying to put something right. What something? Something that's wrong. Something that doesn't feel right. Have you still not got that? Something doesn't feel right. What is it that doesn't feel right? Are you hungry? No. Are you cold? No. Are you feeling too hot? Not really. Perhaps you've got a headache? No, it's not that either. What is it? I just can't figure it out. That's the one I'm talking about. The what you can't quite figure out. The something that doesn't feel right. It's never felt right. But you've always been trying to put it right. This is why you started opening your 5 senses and started to draw in the sights and sounds, followed by smells and tastes, and the sense of touch. Always trying to put that which wasn't right. This is why you needed a plan. So you started borrowing plans from those people who were also trying to put something right by using their 5 senses. Isn't that what you did? As I said, the first 2 people you borrowed a plan from, you conveniently labeled them mother and father. So when you were young, don't you recall when someone asked you, son, what do you want to be when you grow up? What was your first answer to that? I want to be like my father. Little boys might say. I want to be big like my father, like my daddy. I want to be a big person. I want to drive a big car like my daddy. And if you ask little girls, what might they say? Most of the time, they'll say, I want to be lovely. I want to be beautiful like my mummy. Right, so whose plan were they executing? Borrowed plans, right? These are borrowed plans. You didn't have a plan of your own. You came in with an expectation, but having an expectation doesn't necessarily mean you have a plan. You are planless, but you had an expectation which was to satisfy that which had thus far been unsatisfied. Thus far, something that was unfulfilled you wanted to fulfill. Thus far, which was something that was you couldn't quite put your finger on. You wanted to put your finger on it. You wanted to work it out. You wanted to figure it out. You wanted to sort it out. Something wasn't quite right. You wanted to put that right. Fast forward 35 years, 40 years, 50, 65 years. What are you up to now? What are you trying to do now? That's something that wasn't quite right. Is it right now? Something's still not quite right, is it? Something? So 30, 40, 50, 60 years of using your 5 senses to execute borrowed plans, how far has that gotten you on your ambition to put right that which wasn't quite right? How close are you to that ambition? To those of you who believe that we were in this reincarnation cycle many times over in the past, how long then do you think you've been trying to put this something right? In your previous births, what did you do? Were they not borrowed plans? When you got to hear of devas, as you did in this birth, you can't tell me that none of you, when you started to hear stories about the devas, about the gods and deities and the luxuries that they get to enjoy, right, in the heavenly abodes, you can't tell me that there was not a single point in your life where you wished, oh, if only I could. Oh, how I wish I were a god or a goddess or an angel. Did you never? Have you never had that thought pass your mind? Before listening to the Dhamma, yes. Indeed. So, where did you get that plan from? Whose plan was that? Someone told you about gods, right? It could have been a monk. It could have been someone talking about gods and goddesses and deities and divine creatures in a sermon, or perhaps you read it in a book. Or maybe it was when you first read Peter Pan and there was tinsel and you thought, if only I could be like her, flying around with a tail of fairy dust behind me. Who knows? All sorts. Or perhaps when you first was introduced to the superhero genre of cartoons and films. A young kid, I can't imagine a young kid having watched Superman, thought to himself one day, not having thought to himself one day, how do I become Superman? Isn't that why they did the next best thing they could? Got a cape, usually a bedsheet, tied it around their necks, and then climbed up to the tallest thing that they could find in their homes, and then jumped off it, and then couldn't jump again for the next 6 months. Whose plan were you executing? Where did you get that plan from? Where did you buy that plan from? Which bookshop? You got it off the TV box. Right, so that was DC Comics. You borrowed that plan from. Universal Studios, you borrowed that plan from. And then when it was enough of Superman, then you tried Superman, didn't work, then came Batman. What did you do after that? Did you not go and get yourself your own Batmobile? What did that look like? In my case, it was a plastic chair turned upside down. It had its 4 legs. You can imagine a plastic chair turned upside down. Right, the back of the chair now on the ground. Right, that's now the front of my Batmobile. It's got 4 levers. With one I can control the direction of the vehicle. The other one is for the weapons. The third one I can't remember what I can do with them now. It's been a while. The third one I think I could teleport myself. And the 4th leg was my handbrake. So I had my own Batmobile. How about you? Whose plan was that? You know, the thing is, I never wanted to be Batman. That was not the goal. That was not my ambition. I'll give you, yes. At some point, if you'd asked me, Putta, what do you want to be when you grow up? I probably would have said Batman, but that's not quite what I wanted to do. That was my borrowed plan. On that plan, it said, become Batman and all your problems will be gone. What I wanted to really do was to put that which was not right. Right. Something didn't quite feel right. My whole life I've been trying to put that something right. I'm asking you, didn't you try to do the same? When you started growing up and started to do more mature things, like getting a girlfriend, very mature that, isn't it? What was your plan then? Whose plan was that again? Whose plan was that? Chances are, again, that was all inherited from your parents' plans. Now you looked at them, you wondered, how did they come together? Did you not sit down with your mother, father and ask them, how did the two of you come together? And most kids do that sort of thing, right? They ask their parents, Amma, how did you meet Appachi? Mommy, how did you meet Daddy? When you first ask that question as a young child, they sort of they'll talk about it in a very fond, recalling manner. But the older you grow, and if you ask the question sort of in your late 20s, how did you meet Daddy or Appachi? Usually the response back is by mistake. So that happens. That's when they can be more candid about the true nature of life. But then by that time, you've already gone a long way on the plan. It's too late to turn back. So they know that nothing that's going to come from us is going to turn you around. Right? So you're sealed to that plan. It's a tough pill to swallow when you ask that question about where did I come from, and you get the same response from them. By mistake. That's a tough pill to swallow, but sometimes that can be the case. So anyway, aren't you all on someone else's plan? What that means is you're blindfolded. In other words, like when you're playing that game at the New Year festivities, Kanamutti Bindin, right? So people are cheering at you, cheering you on. Left, left, left. Oh no, right, right, right. A little bit to the left, right. Turn around, turn around, turn around. Yes, yes, now go on. Forward, forward. These are the instructions on your plan, right? Get it out, have a look at it. Are you not on someone's plan right now, today? What are you going to be doing today? The things that you have scheduled for today, did you not borrow it off of someone else's plan? What's the plan for the evening? What did you do yesterday? Start of the weekend, Saturday. What did you do yesterday? What are weekends for? What does it say on the plan? What are weekends for? It's to enjoy, have a good time, relax after a long week, get together with some friends, hit the clubs, go dancing, make something nice, cook something nice, right? Try out a new dessert, maybe try and bake that new cake you saw on that magazine. Does this sound like anything like what you did yesterday? Any of the above? Or is it all of the above? Watch some TV, watch a film, go out to the movies. They've reopened them now, haven't they? What else? I'm not undermining any of them. I'm just saying, where did you get those things from? Were they not all things you got off a borrowed plan? And those borrowed plans, did they not come from people who are still trying to put something that they never thought they felt was right? They never thought felt right, right? They're still trying to put it right. They still haven't put it right. Did you not borrow plans from a bunch of people like that? Aren't you still blindfolded? Something that didn't quite feel right. How's it feeling now? You can't tell me, no, Swaminatha, everything felt right from day one. If that were the case, you wouldn't have opened your eyes. If everything felt fine with your eyes closed, question, why would you want to open your eyes? Does that not require extra energy? Why do we spend energy? We spend energy when we want to get some work done. Why do we want to do some work? Because we want to get from one state to a state that is better than the present state, right? That is what work is for. To get to a state that is better than the present state, right? So that requires energy. Opening your eyelids requires energy. So you're opening your eyelids because you want to get to a state which is better than the present state, which is when you have your eyelids closed. Okay, so again I go back to my original question. Was it all right when you had your eyelids closed? Isn't that why you opened your eyelids? So is it right now? Is it not because it was never right you had to grab all 5 senses and you're still not right? You see, the extent to which people are still not quite satisfied, not fulfilled, I can show you. It's not enough to be able to see what you can see with your naked eyes. Yes or no? Would you agree with me? For the humankind, animals don't have this problem. For the humankind, it's not enough to be able to see what you can see with your naked eyes. Agree or disagree? For the human race, it's not enough to be able to hear what you can hear with your naked ears. Agreed or disagreed? For the human type, it's not enough to be able to smell what you can smell with your naked nose. Agree or not? Or taste with your bare tongue, or touch with your bare senses. How far, when you have seen, do you think is going to be enough for man? That's as far as we want to see. We don't need to see any further than that. When is man going to say that? How deep is it enough for man to go and say that's enough, we don't need to go any further? We don't need to go any deeper. How high does man want to fly? When man's going to say that's enough, we don't need to fly any higher. Animals aren't like that. That's the thing. Animals will go in search of food. When they've found it, they'll stop. Migration. In search of food. When they've found it, they'll stop. Animals have very little, if no, curiosity. But man is riddled with curiosity. Just believe me, right? Oh, you don't need to believe me. Answer this question. We've got 54 books in the Tripitaka, right? Let's say one fine day, some historian says, we've just discovered another book. We've discovered another book, a new book. It's the 54th book of the Tripitaka, and we found it in some temple, in some cave, right? And it says this is the 54th book of the Tripitaka. And let's say they'll put it on the internet. They'll scan the pages and put it on the internet. Question. Are you going to now go up to your library and borrow one of the 53 books and start reading that? Or are you going to go online and start scanning the pages of the 54th book? You had all 53 at your disposal. But you wanted to go for the new one, the 54th. I probably got my numbers wrong. The perhaps 54 books and 55th book. Doesn't matter, besides the point. My point being, if they find a new one, isn't that the one that's going to pique your interest? Have you read all the other books? Have you read all of the 54? Is that why when they find the 55th, you want to go and have a look at that? Curiosity. This is because we're all on a borrowed plan. On our borrowed plan, it says in bold, it's good to be curious. It's good to find out more. It's good to learn more. It's good to go and discover more. And so with that being the instruction on our borrowed plans, without as much as a second thought, off you go. Trying to find an answer to that age-old question. Something doesn't quite feel right. I'm not sure what it is, but I'm going to do everything I possibly can to try and put myself to ease, put myself to contentment, and bring myself to fulfillment. How long have you tried? How much longer will you try? I think the answer is the same to both questions. Is that not right? How long have you tried to put it right? How many years? How many births? And how many years are you going to try to put it right? How many years? Or how many births? That's why this samsara is endless. People are trying to put that which doesn't quite feel right, right. Trying to seek a fulfillment, trying to seek a satisfaction that is always elusive. Does that not speak volumes about the content of the plan? Does that not tell us a lot about the plan itself? These words may sound quite, very philosophical, but there is, as I said, a lot of depth in these words, and I want you all to experience that depending on your understanding. However far you can go, absorb it to that degree. If the distance you can go is, Swaminathan is talking about some 55th book. I just need to go online and find out where that is. If you think I'm talking about that literally, then maybe go and see if they found another one. If you do, tell us also. But if you can see the depth that I'm trying to convey to you here, ask yourself some important questions. All of these efforts, all this quest, all this energy is to achieve one thing. That is to put that something right. Something never felt right. Something always felt very odd. Like how sometimes you feel that an odd taste in your mouth. You can't quite figure out how that came. You didn't eat anything, but just out of nowhere, some funny taste starts to linger in your mouth. I'm talking about that something which you've always been trying to put right, but it never was right. You've tried and tried and tried, and you'll always keep trying until you understand the essence of these words. Let me take you back to a couple of sermons ago. It was titled, if I remember right, "You are not who you think you are." Hopefully you listened to that a couple of times at least. In that sermon, I started to give you a glimpse into this real something, this real problem, that which doesn't quite feel right. It's no wonder it doesn't feel right, because there's no way it can feel right, because it's totally wrong. That's why it can't feel right. You never felt like, this is something that just feels right. I don't know what that is. You never felt that way, right? Something feels right, I don't know what it is. No one feels like that. People feel something doesn't feel right. Something doesn't feel right, not something feels right. What is it? Something doesn't feel right, and I quite can't figure out what it is. So that's why you need a borrowed plan. That's why you go asking people, how have you managed to... the problem is this also. You can't describe it, because you don't know the words to describe it. In that sermon, I asked you, have you ever found yourself in a conversation with someone where you were complaining about me, as in not me, the Swaminathan, say? You probably do that a lot of the time. I'm talking about you, as in yourself, as in me, I. Have you ever complained to someone, I feel like I today? Has that ever been a complaint? I feel myself today. Usually your complaint is what? I don't feel like myself today. So you're saying something doesn't quite feel right. You know what I'm going to tell you now? Something doesn't feel quite right because you're feeling yourself. This probably sounds like gobbledygook, and you're wondering, what did you eat for breakfast today, Swaminathan? I know, you're trying to figure this out and all these words, and it's alright, relax. Right? We can work this out one step at a time. This entanglement can be opened up, and it'll all become clear to you. Would you agree with me or not that you always felt that something wasn't quite right? The most basic, the most simple evidence I can put forward to prove that point to you is, even to this day, you're using your 5 senses. You're to bring in information from the outside world, because you're not satisfied with how things are right now. Do you get my point there? Let me give you an imaginary situation. Forget that you have a sense of hearing, right? So let's just disregard that. You don't. So I want you to imagine you can't hear a thing. Oh, sorry, I forgot. You listen to the sermon, so you won't be able to follow through the rest of this if you do that. Okay. Let's keep your sense of hearing and imagine everything else is non-functional. So you can't see anything. You've gone blind. You can't taste anything. You can't smell anything. Your sense of touch is no longer working, so you can't feel anything. Right? So your eyes are your ears are functional, but your eyes aren't, so you can't see anything. You can hear, you can't smell anything, you can't taste anything, you can't feel anything. Now, with your sense of hearing available to you, you have your ears open, always waiting for the next bit of data to come in from the outside world. Like a hoover that's always sucking in air, and that's how a hoover works, right? You're always sucking in air. A vacuum cleaner, for those of you familiar with that terminology, a vacuum cleaner is always sucking in air. Your ears, as much as all the other senses, are always sucking in data from the outside world. These are your input devices. They're sucking in data from the outside world. My question is, why? Now I want you to start to think. Why? I want you to start to think before I give you the answer. That helps you to develop your wisdom faculty. Use your intelligence, right? And using the words that you hear, couple them up and start to develop your wisdom faculty. This is the Panya Indriya. And that can happen, it happens better when you're thinking things through yourself rather than me saying it all out loud. I will, but I'm giving you time to think. Right? So back to my question. We have, for the time being, imagined that all the other 4 senses are non-functional. So the only sense that is available to you is your ears, and of course you can think, right? So the mind is operational also. So you can hear, you can hear sounds that are coming from the outside. So that data is only flowing through your ears. My question to you is, why? Why are you sucking in all that data? Does that not require energy? Even for the sound waves to come and hit your eardrums and then that to vibrate the little hairs in your inner ears, right? And that to take the signals to your brains and the processing that happens in your brains. Right? All that requires energy. That's why a dead man can't hear. A dead man doesn't respond to sounds or any sort of noise that comes from the outside, right? So because it requires energy, there's no energy in the body of a dead soul. So this requires energy. Now you're spending energy here. In fact, do you not sometimes lean closer to something to get more of the auditory data? Sometimes don't you lean in if someone's whispering? Sorry, what did you say? You move forward. You lean forward. And you hold your ear closer to their mouth, trying to get that information. Sometimes you cusp your hand, don't you? And close it to you and hold it behind your ear. Simple science behind that is to get more of the sound waves to travel into your ear. Right? So this is again effort that is being made. Energy is being spent to get in more of the data. Why is my question. Now I want you to start to think about in new terms, right? So those days, yes, we spoke about the same things, and we talked about vexation and relief from vexation. All of that still holds. But what I want you to start to think now is in terms of what I just spoke to you a few minutes ago, right? That which doesn't quite feel right. There's something that doesn't feel right. I'm proposing to you that what you're not feeling is right is you. I'll help you untangle that. I'll help you unwrap what I've just said there. So park that to a side for a moment. What you're not feeling is quite right is actually you. That I that you sense, that presence that you feel. The you, the I, the me, the self, the Natasha that we have been talking about, the Sam, for over the last several sermons we've been talking about this. This is building up to something else, right? So, but I want to take you all step by step, which is why I'm not bombarding all of this in one sermon. So step by step, if you're taking your medicines, then you'll be ready for the climax, if you like. The crescendo is coming, but you gotta wait for it. This build-up is gradual. You need to take the time to understand it, because I realize that I am talking to you about after a week of having meditated, listened to sermons, preached, having had discussions with our monks, having had meetings with my teachers. Right, so a lot of my day is spent with the Dhamma. So I'm talking to you about after a week of that activity. I'm talking to you after you have had a week of a lot of mundane activity. Is that wrong? No, that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is we got to appreciate that there is a distinct difference on the two platforms that we're standing. So it is my duty to make this intelligible to you. Right, so let's get back to the question I asked. It's only your sense of hearing that's working. All of the other senses are shut down temporarily. So you only know that this world exists because you can hear sounds. They're coming through your ears. Why are you wanting? Why do you want? Why are you waiting for sounds to reach your ear? What are you waiting for this data for? What is the purpose? Are you not trying to put something right? If it was right now, if everything was fine right now, would you need to take in data from your ears? Have you ever solved a problem that wasn't a problem? The old expression goes, if it ain't a problem, don't fix it. So, if you're trying to fix something, then clearly there's a problem there. You're trying to fix something. That is why you're taking in sounds that are coming from the outside. There's a problem that you're trying to address. I'm asking you to focus on one sense of one sensory input, because the same applies all around for the all other senses also, but it helps you to focus on one. Right now you can hear this voice, and you're paying attention to the words that are coming from my mouth. These words are data to you, and you're taking in this data to process it in the hope that you will be able to fix that which doesn't feel right. That's my proposal. Agreed? Do you agree that mentally there is a problem that needs to be fixed? There's never been a point where everything's been fine, been all right. People do all sorts of things to be all right, right? Some people get together to be all right. Right? Let's get together and be all right. It's all sorts of things people do to be all right. Some people, they listen to music to be all right. Some people watch movies, some people eat, some people sleep, some people go out, some people party, some people go to work, some people don't go to work to be all right. But everyone's trying to be all right, right? So what does this all right mean? Means when everything is right, that's all right. As in, all is right. So when you're trying to be all right, something's not quite right yet. That something is what you're trying to fix, so that you can be in a state of all right. Isn't that why you've got your ears open? You're waiting for information to come from the outside so you can feel all right. You can be all right. Something that is not all right, you now have some hope of putting right. Because after all, you know that an arahant is always all right. Do you think an arahant ever has any mental problems? Is there ever a point you're going to find an arahant, you ask, Venerable Sir, how are you? So. Mentally they're not fully 100%. Do you think you're ever going to find an arahant like that? That's an impossibility. Because mentally they have achieved satisfaction, they have achieved fulfillment. They are not looking for something because they don't have a problem. They don't have a something's not all right. They don't have a something doesn't quite feel right to put right. Because they are right. Okay? So, them versus us. Who's them? The arahants. Who's us? Well, us. We are trying to put it right. We are using our ears to take in information, to take in data, to solve this problem. Now, of course, this is on a borrowed plan. Because on the borrowed plan it says, use your ears to take in data to put things right. On a borrowed plan it would say, use your eyes to take in data to put things right. Sound, smell, taste and touch the same. Use these 5 senses to take in data to put things right. And this data, when it doesn't come, we've got to go find it. If to put things right, this data, let's assume it's visual and it comes from a necklace that belongs to your neighbor, well then you need that necklace to be always available so that you can always look at it and gain that satisfaction and fulfillment. So if it belongs to your neighbor, you don't have it with you, right? What do you have to do now? Now you got to go get it. And that is possible by two means, by hook or by crook. These are efforts to get what you want, to fulfill and satisfy that which for your entire journey in samsara has remained unfulfilled. Something doesn't feel right. That you're trying to put right. That is why you're using your five senses, to take in data, to process it, to somehow try to put out this burning fire, to somehow try to heal this wound. It's like an internal itch, isn't it? Aren't you grateful that itches you only feel on the outside? That you only ever felt like, your head itch. So by head I mean your scalp, right? Then your skin, your parts of your skin, your hands, your arms, your leg, your feet, right? Your stomach, back. You felt an itch on parts of your body. Aren't you glad that you only felt an itch on the exterior part of your body? What if you got an itch on the inside? Like, what if your lung all of a sudden started to itch? Your left lung. I got an itch on my left lung. Good heavens, what am I going to do now? What if your liver started to itch? What are you going to do now? It's bad enough when your back starts to itch. What about when your liver starts to itch? Now, you see, you'll be helpless because you can't reach, you can't describe it. It's coming from the inside. You know you've got a liver because you learnt it at school. How else do you know you've got a liver? How else would you know? You know you've got lungs because you learnt it at school, right? Otherwise, how would you know you've got lungs? You can't see your lungs, you can't see your liver or your spleen or your stomach, you can't see any of these things. So you don't know that you've got these things inside of you unless you learn about them. Similarly, when you have an internal itch, for someone who doesn't know the inside anatomy of the body, just as much as they're helpless in terms of expressing, I've got an itch on the inside. Where on the inside? Just on the inside. That's how you're going to be able to say it. If you didn't know what the parts of the body are and where they are in proportion to other parts of the anatomy, you're just going to have to say, there's an itch on the inside and I don't know how to say it, but I know it's an itch. Help. You'd be stuck. Similarly, there's an itch in your mind. The mental itch. That's that mental itch you're trying to scratch. Are you all on board with what I'm trying to explain to you here? Do you all not sense a mental itch that you've been trying to scratch forever? Just imagine this for a second, right? Let's say you got an itch on your arm, or some rash, right? A rash on your arm, and now it's starting to itch. Now, I want you to imagine a situation where you're allowed to scratch it, but here's the thing. Only the fingertip of your finger can touch the surface of your skin, and when you do that, it just irritates it even more. So you can't really scratch yourself. It's as if you were given a strand of hair to rub over your rash. Imagine that. Right? So it's a rash and it's very itchy. Someone gives you a strand of hair and says, right, go on. That's all you can bring in contact with your rash. Another good example might be when you have a wound that's healing, but it's under a bandage, and the doctor's instruction, do not touch it, but it's itching. What do? Right, now you try to compress the wound from the outside, right? Because you're forbidden to touch it. It's going to make things worse. But you try pressing it from the outside. You'll try tugging on your skin, right? You'll try rubbing it in places. One thing you can't do is you can't put your finger on it and scratch it. Imagine that. So similarly, now imagine an itch, not any old itch, a mental itch. And when you try to scratch it, you can only just about touch the surface of it. You can only just about touch the surface of it. You can't go any deeper. When you have a bad itch, how badly do you want to scratch it? Don't you want to scratch it until the skin comes off? Like, wouldn't you scratch it like a tiger ripping up its prey? And the doctor says, don't do that, it's gonna get worse. Well, I'll look after that when it gets worse. Right now, what's bad is this terrible itch. I'm the one who's got it. You don't understand what I'm talking about, right? That's what you'd say to your doctor. Now, I want you to think about the same in terms of a mental itch. We've all got this mental itch. We've always had it, and we've always tried to scratch it. It's never gone away because you're not allowed to, properly put your, put your 100% into it and rip it out. You're not allowed to do that. You can't do it. You're just a tiny tip of your whatever you can use to scratch your mental itch. So it's just rubbing on the surface. And every time you do that, it only gets worse. Because now you're irritating it with every rub. I don't know if you're seeing the metaphor here. It's a very powerful one. Mental itch. So that is that which never felt right. That's that mental itch. It never felt right. Did all sorts of things to scratch it. You borrowed 100 million plans, a gazillion plans you borrowed off of every person you came across. Friends and family and teachers, right? You borrowed plans from every Tom, Dick and Harry. But none of them has worked so far. You're still itching yourself. You're still scratching yourself. You can still feel the mental itch. That is why you're still not satisfied. Two weeks ago we talked about you not being who you think you are. I'm trying to show you the connection here now. You know what you are? You are a mental itch. That's why you never quite felt right. Whenever you said, I don't quite feel right, something doesn't feel right, that's that mental itch. What are you feeling? You're feeling you. You're feeling yourself. I'm going to try and help you visualize this. Right, so let's try and sketch this up as best we can. Right, so over the last several weeks we've been talking about something. You probably couldn't figure what that something was. Maybe a little bit, maybe not sure. Right? But we've been building up. So I'm going to help you today to try and piece those things together. Right, your memory of the stuff we talked about in the previous sermons is going to be essential here. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to tie all of this up together. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to help you. Now that you have brought together all the parts, I'm going to help you piece them all up together. If you haven't got the part with you, I'm not sure I can help you a lot. In listening to the previous sermons, what you did was you collected all the parts. What I'm going to show you today is how do you pull all that together. So if you are missing a part, that was probably in the sermon that we did 3 weeks ago. If you are missing part number 3521C, you're probably missing, or you probably missed 20 minutes of the sermon from 5 weeks ago. What am I supposed to do? Right, so if you're ready with all those parts, I'm going to try and help you piece them all together. Okay, I'll revisit some of the stuff we talked about in the past a little bit, but I'm not going to be able to linger too long on that. We may do in future sermons as we talk more about this, but for the scope of today's sermon, let's take a first attempt to piece all these parts together. Alright, so I'm going to try and bring the screen up here. So if you'll bear with me while I try to get the screen up on display. Okay. So first let's talk about what we already know. Just a quick refresher. This is stuff we already know. We paid a brief visit to our 5 senses, which is stuff we've talked about in the past. Right? So we know the world that we live in. Oops. We know the world that we live in through our 5 senses. Right, so when we talk about 5 senses, we know we're talking about our eyes, our ears, nose, tongue, and the sense of touch. Okay, so this is stuff we've talked about in the past. They all receive inputs from the outside world in terms of sights, sounds, smell, taste, and touch. Right? This is all stuff, but good refresher. And we've talked about this in great length. Those who have listened to the previous sermons will know this. Our regulars will most certainly be able to recall a lot of this stuff. Now these five senses, they bring in information into our mind, as we know, through the brain, but we're going to skip that bit for now because that's not what we're trying to focus on. Okay, so this information, it comes to our mind. Now our mind is waiting to absorb this data. I'm going slow so that it gives you time to remind yourselves about all of this stuff and to help piece all this together. Excuse me. So our mind is waiting for sensory inputs from the five senses. We also know that the mind has its own data store. These are our memories. Okay, but we'll leave that for now. Now, we know that when these things reach the mind, as in these sensory inputs reach the mind, they're all converted to rupa. And you know that rupa comes in 6 forms, right? So there's Rupa Rupa, Shabda Rupa, Gandha Rupa, Rasa Rupa, Sparsha Rupa, and Dhamma Rupa. So this is sensory inputs, sensory impressions to do with sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental thoughts, or memories if you like, the Dhammas. This is the primary input to the mind. This Rupa is the primary input to the mind. This is a mental object. This is what in Pali they call an aramana. In Sinhala, aramuna, a mental object. When this reaches the mind, the function of the mind is to detail what has just arrived in the mind. That is the nature of the mind. The mind, by its very nature, is, I suppose you could put it this way. If you wanted to define what a chitta is, it is the ability to define a mental object. That is what a chitta is. It's the ability to define a mental object. So if it couldn't define a mental object, if it couldn't define and detail a mental object, then it shouldn't be called a chitta. So thoughts arise in the mind, and I'm using mind and thoughts interchangeably here. Let's not worry too much about the distinction between the two. We'll talk about those subjects in future sermons, right? But for the time being, think about mind, think about chitta, it doesn't really matter. So the basic primary function of a chitta is to detail the mental object that has just arrived from the outside. So this is the primary input. That detailing happens in terms of Vedana, Sanya, Sankara. Vedana, you'll remember, we denote with the letter V. This Vedana is the notification that a mental object has just arrived on a mind door. I just said mind door because there are 6 mental doors. These are the doors which take information out from the outside world. So Vedana is the function of the mind. So like a car that has various pieces, various devices which have various functions. So there'll be one device that will inform you that the fuel level has dropped below a certain level. So that's the fuel gauge. Then you'll have the speedometer, right? So various devices like that. You have the Vedana, which is the function of the mind, of the Chitta, if you like, which indicates that a Rupa has just arrived. The metaphor we have used in the past is when someone comes knocking on the door, right? So you're at home, there's someone on the outside. You don't know about this until the person arrives and knocks on the door, right? So until there's the knock, you don't know that someone's arrived. The analogy here is this Rupa, be that Rupa Rupa, Shabda Rupa, Gandha Rupa, Rasa Rupa, Sparsha Rupa, Dhamma Rupa. This Rupa, the mental object, is this visitor. That's the visitor to the mind. The mind has just had a visitor. But the mind wouldn't know about it until and unless that knock is heard. So that's why I say it's a notification. It's an alert. So as the moment this Rupa hits the mind, Vedana happens. That's a notification, right? So that we know. Followed by this, in this example, what you would normally do is you'd walk up to the door, you'd open the door, and you would examine your visitor to identify the visitor. That is what sanya is. That is the identification. So this is the notification. Pretty much all of these have various definitions. Let's focus on what we need for the purpose of our discussion today. So sanya is the identification. Okay. Then we have the sankhara. Sankhara is having seen who your visitor is, now you decide how to greet them, don't you? If it, for example, a beggar, chances are you're not going to invite them to come on in, take a seat, and offer them a glass of orange juice. Chances are you're going to talk to them outside, you're going to ask them what you want. Can I give you some, would you like some food, right? Then you probably say, please stay here, I'm going to go and get some. You might even close the door before you go into the kitchen and bring the food, right? So that's probably how you'd greet a beggar. But let's imagine it's a family member. Chances are then you'll open the door and you'll welcome them and say, come on in, take a seat. So these are the things that you do to greet them. If it were a monk, what might you do? You'd probably invite them to come in, and at the same moment, if you have some other family member at home, you'd probably say, please can you go and get a piece of white cloth so you can put it on the chair and invite the monk to sit down, right? So that's the sankhara. These are, I suppose, you could say activities or actions which can be taken upon the respective visitor to the mind. So what is the visitor to the mind here? It's the rupa. This is the mental object. So an object has arrived onto the mind, the mental platform. An object has arrived, hence mental object. What we are doing now is we are detailing that object for the purpose of identifying and recognizing it. Okay, so that's actions, and then finally we know it's vijnana. So with vijnana, the purpose of vijnana, the function of vijnana is to amalgamate all of the above. So now that we have, for this rupa, we've been notified that the rupa has arrived, we have identified it. We know what actions can be taken with it. Now we have a complete picture. In other words, we perceive that mental object. So I'm going to put the word here, perception. It's how you perceive it. Okay, so this is all stuff. Most of you will know this like the back of your hand. So this is all good stuff. We are all familiar with all this. So reminder. So perception would be, if you go back to the analogy here, the story that you might tell. Let's say you had your visitor, you sit down with them, you talk with them, you give them a drink, and right. So they spend a couple of hours at home, and then they take they leave. Now, let's say at the end of the day, your husband comes home, and then he asks, "So how's your day?" And then you relate the story, right? Oh, did you know? Sam came earlier on today, right? So Sam came, I was in the kitchen, he knocked on the door, that's how or he rang the bell, he didn't even knock on the door, he opened the door and he called my name, that's how I knew he was at the door, unusual, but so that's how got to know about him. Then you recognize that it was Sam's, that was the identification. Then you'll say, so I invited him, I asked him to sit down, I got him a drink, and we talked about this, that, and the other, right? Apparently his daughter's run away with the guy next door. You'll talk about all that stuff, and so this is the entire picture. Now you can relate a story. You have a full story about that mental object. You have a story about your visitor. You can think of vijnana in those terms. That's how you have perceived your visitor. Okay, so I think all clear with that. Now, we also know that, again, stuff we've talked about before, that all conditional things arise and pass away. Why are they called conditional? Because they arise due to conditions, and they pass away when those conditions which were present for their arising are no longer present, or they're passing away. With their passing away, who's passing away? With the passing away of the causes, that conditional entity begins to pass away. So it's like fading in and fading out. It's actually a lot like that, rather than on-off. So it's not a 1-0. It's more like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 1. So it's a gradual arising. That's why I say it's fading in and fading out, rather than on-off. That's why we draw a sine curve to represent this phenomenon. Right? It's not a square like this. Right? We don't draw it like that. That's the 0, 1, 0, 1. Like we do in computer science. This is more a sine curve. That's why we draw it like this. Okay, so we know this story. Arising and passing away, fading in, fading out. You can think of it in those terms. And then remember, this is an energy. We're talking about the mind. The mind is an energy. It's not a physical thing. Does the mind really exist? Or is that also fake? How do we know if something's fake or not? What is our baseline? What do we check it against? Whether something's fake or not, what do we check it against? We can check it either using the Buddha's teaching, where he talks about the absolute truths, or we can also check with what we know about those who have achieved a state of mind where they function in the absolute truths. So we're talking about the Arahants. So we know about the 4 absolute truths: Chittas, Chaitasikas, Rupa, and Nibbana. Right? So we know about those 4, and in there the Buddha talks about Chittas and Chaitasikas, thoughts and mental factors. Or he refers to them as consciousness, Either way, it doesn't matter really. So anyway, we know that it's an arising and passing away function that's happening here, and this is with time, on the time axis. Now, remember what we are trying to do is we are trying to find an answer to a very important question. This is why we are revisiting this topic. Let me jot down what that question is. We try to find where's Sam. Remember that question? Where's Sam? We ask the question, who am I? Remember? Long time ago we talked about baby Natasha. Right? Then we said, you are not who you think you are. Okay? I think with various other names. Oh, today we spoke about something's not quite right. Right? So that which is not quite right. Not quite right. Oh, and then of course we talked in the most simplest terms, me, self. How else did we refer to this? The I am, we talked about that in one of our sermons, I am. And we started wondering if that is the problem. And remember when I talked to you about the ascetics or the Brahmins back in the day, in the time of the Buddha, and they went to the Buddha looking for answers, and they asked, where's the I? Where's the self? Is it in the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana? So this stuff, right? Is it in any of this? They asked. Is it inside, outside, left, right, top, bottom? Right? These are some of the questions they asked. Presence. That's another way we spoke about this. The feeling of a presence. I think you get the picture. Right? These are lots of different ways we spoke about the same thing, if you like. Oh, and then there was also the someone, something. Remember we talked, I think that was probably one of the first things we did. Someone, something. Oh, who's on the chair? Remember? Something. Who's on the chair? As I said, I'm trying to help you to bring all these pieces together today. If these things don't ring a bell, that's my fault, so I'm sorry. I'm being sarcastic. It's not my fault. If these things don't ring a bell, it's because you haven't listened to that sermon. So you're going to have to go back and listen to it. Like each of these sermons are probably 2.5 to 3 hours long. So you can't expect me now to talk to you about all of these things in those terms. So fine. I mean, if you don't follow this sermon, then you just got to pause this, go back and listen to those sermons, and then you can come back. It's not the end of the world yet. So, who's on the chair, right? All these things we are trying to talk about. Now, let's try and piece all this together. First of all, I want you to understand that this phenomenon, which phenomenon? The arising and passing away, this sine curve that I've drawn on the screen, is something that happens for real. This is not fake. How do we test that? How do we test and check if something's fake or not? As we just said, we first go with the teaching of the Buddha, or alternatively, we can always ask ourselves, does this happen in the case of an arahant? We are talking about the arising and passing away of the chitta. Does an arahant have chittas? Well, of course an arahant has chittas. He has a body, he or she, I mean, there's a body and there's a mind, right? So the mind arises and passes away. And in that mind, we have rupa. So rupas Be that any one of these types, we talked about 6 here, right? Any one of these types, they arise and pass away in the mind of an arahant. So that is not a fake. There's nothing wrong with that. Does that bring any suffering? No. How do we know? Because it happens in the mind of an arahant, and an arahant has no mental itch. Oh, that's the other thing we said, mental itch. So an arahant has no suffering. No, there's no mental suffering. The arising and passing away phenomenon happens in their mind. Now then, you'll know from your study, perhaps, of the Dhamma, that an arahant does not feel a self. You'll probably know that from your study of the Dhamma. That's fine. Let's not get too worried about that. From your study of the Dhamma, you'll know that an arahant does not feel a self. What is this self? You'll recall some time ago I asked you to do a little experiment. It was a little activity rather, where I asked you to close your eyes and I asked you to go back into your most distant memory from your childhood, and then I asked you, who was there in that situation? I think we probably, although I couldn't hear your voices, got a unanimous I was there when I was younger. So there was an I. I was 6. The things that happened to in my life when I was a young child, see, all the while you're talking about the same I, right? When I was a young child, these things happened to me. Is that a different me today? No, it's the same me today. Is that a different I you're talking about today? No, it's the same I you're talking about today. You'll say, I lived a lay life and today I'm ordained. See? It's the same I you're talking about. So remember we talked about the I stays the same, and then the world, the things that happen to the I, these are the dots that I draw around this circle. The things that happen to this I, they keep flowing. Right? So it just goes on like this. So it's never ending, right? You can draw it like this. It's never ending. Lots of things keep happening. But I, which is the someone, perceives some things happening to it and around it. So here's the observer. I is the observer. The observer is observing the things that are happening around it. Now these things that are happening around it are things like, I'm seeing something. So let's go back up here to the 5 senses. When I am seeing something, that's the sight that comes through the eye into the mind, which generates a rupa. Along with that, there's the notification that a rupa has just arrived, knock, knock, knock. It is then identified. Various actions that can be taken upon it are then executed or realized, and then finally the perception, the story you tell about it. So you'll understand the story requires all of the above parts, right? That's how you can relate a whole story. You need all of the above parts to relate the story. That's why the Buddha says, without the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vijnana, there is no basis to talk about a Vijnana. So all of the above has to come into place before a story can be told. Otherwise you are left with blanks in your story. So it's like, guess what? Someone came today. Who? I can't remember who. That's what you would say if you couldn't remember who you saw at the door and what did you do? Actually I can't remember. So if you don't recall the sanya and the sankhara, you're lost. You can't relate that story. And if you don't know someone came, if you didn't get the notification, then you don't know that someone came in the first place. So your perception is the amalgamation of all the above. Now, that's a bit of a sidestep. But you'll understand then, the I is observing the things that are happening around it, of which 1/6 of it will be sights, the other 6 will be sounds, the other 6 will be smell, taste, touch, and finally the mental memories. Okay? Now they come to the mind in the form of rupa. So let's take, for example, an event. I'm going to talk to you about when you went to the beach. So when you went to the beach, let's relate the story in terms of from the point where you got off your vehicle and you walked up to the beachfront. Okay, so now you're standing on the beach with your feet in the sand, right? Your toes dug into the sand, and you're looking out at the sea. What's coming into your mind? How do you know that this is happening? Firstly, you can see the sea. So that's a sight. So that rupa, and the Vedana, Sanya, Sankara and Vijnana, that set of 5, they come and park on the mind. So they arise in the mind. Right? This 5, they drop on the mind. On a chitta, if you like. Remember, they don't all appear at once, right? We know that. This is on the time axis. So you only have one at any given moment in time. Actually, you don't even have a whole one. There's only one point on this at any given point in time. So if a chitta takes, say, 5 seconds, at t equals 1 second, you're not going to have all of this. You're not going to have all of this. Right, from here to here, you're not going to have all of that. You're only going to have 1/5 of it. In fact, you're not even going to have the entire 1/5 of it. You're only going to have that point which is evident at the point t equals 1. What happened to that chitta at t equals 0.8 has already passed away. So you must understand that this is a visual representation along the time axis. So at any given point, you don't have all of this. You only have a single point. Hopefully that makes sense. Right? It's a bit like, you can think of this as, like a path that you traveled. If you drew from Kandy to Colombo, and I draw the path on a map, and you told me that took us 3 hours for the journey, you understand that this is the path for the entire 3 hours that you see on the map. Right? Where were you at? So if you left at 2 o'clock and you arrived at 5 o'clock, even if I asked you, where were you at 2:45, you're not going to say, I was here. You're going to say, I was here. You're going to say, X marks the spot. I was here at 2:45. That's what you're going to say. Or rather, if I just bring it back to where I drew the circle, right? You're probably going to say, I was here. X. You're not going to say, I was here and draw a whole, large portion of the map. That's not where you were at 2:45. That's the distance you covered from 2 o'clock to 2:45. Fair enough? Okay, so likewise, it's an important point that I'm trying to make here. This distinction is important. That's why I'm dwelling on this. I want you to understand, folks, that this chitta is not a everlasting entity. It's not they don't come in wholes. They don't come in packets as such. Every moment, every tiny moment on the chitta path is a result of causes at that moment. So at the very next moment, what happened to the chitta at the very previous moment is no longer happening to it. So every moment on this path is a result of causes. So these are all effects. This is all cause and effect. Every moment on this. I'm hoping this makes sense, but we'll continue to talk about this in future, and it will make more sense. So all these lines I'm drawing, each of these lines will be, not each of the lines rather, but each of the points on this path is the only thing that's going to be available at every point at each individual point. Okay? Right. So get rid of that for the moment. Right. So I'm talking about a 5. This is the Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana that comes and lands on the Chitta. Anything wrong with that Rupa or Vedana or the rest of it? No. Why? How do we know? Because that can happen in the mind of an Arahant and there is no suffering. We know that the cause of suffering is attachment. Right? So suffering is caused by attachment. Attachment, among many other causes, lead to suffering. You know, I've just liked that. Attachment, not among many other causes, lead to suffering. Attachment is the sole cause of suffering. If you didn't correct me there, at least, or if you didn't feel that something's not quite right with what I just said, then again, you need to go back and listen to those previous sermons. Attachment is the only cause of suffering. You don't have 2, 3, 4, give me one. There's only one. Attachment. So attachment causes suffering. Now, in the mind of an Arahant, you don't have suffering. That tells us that there is no attachment in the mind. In the mind of a non-Arahant, there is suffering, which tells us that there is attachment in the mind. We've also spoken about suffering being twofold primarily. Do you recall that? Remember, there was one, that's fear, and the other is grief. Fear is the form of suffering that you experience when you have something that you want. Grief is a form of suffering you experience when you don't have what you want. This is why you remember in our previous sermons we said, having or not having, neither of these is the cause of suffering. Attachment is not the cause of fear and grief. Well, it is. What I'm saying is, rather, let me put it this way. Having or not having is not the cause of fear and grief. Having something or not having something is not the cause of suffering. Attachment is the cause of suffering. When you're attached to something you have, that causes fear. When you're attached to something you don't have, that causes grief. We've come across in the famous Dhammapada stanza, Tanhaya jayati soko, which is grief, Tanhaya jayati bhayam. Tanhaya vipamuttasya nati soko kuto bhayam. So, due to attachment exists grief, due to attachment exists fear. Whence one has extinguished attachment, there is no grief or fear. So attachment is the cause of fear and grief that we know. Now, let's apply that concept back into what we've been talking about rather. So you're at the beach, you're looking at the sea. Through your eyes, you see let's say the sunset. Okay. So you see the sunset, and that's the 5 that arises in the mind. Let's imagine there's you and an Arahant. What do you mean you and an Arahant? Swaminas, I am the Arahant. Okay, right. You and I then, right? So you're the Arahant, and then there's poor old me. Now we're both standing at the beachside, and we are both looking at the sunset. In the mind of the Arahant, the five, that is the Rupa, and the Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana, will arise and pass away along with the mind. So they travel with the mind. What happens to the mind happens to them, because they are visitors on the mind. Right? So they'll arrive, they'll arise on the mind, and then they'll pass away. So that's the path they take. Now, what happens in the mind of a non-Arahant? When there's attachment to the five, this Rupa, there's going to be fear. Okay? So fear, and then there's going to be grief. Let's imagine that these are the points where the five, or this pack is present. So they will experience fear. Let's imagine at this point, there's nothing to imagine, that's the way it works. At this level, as we go further, we'll talk about this in more detail, and then you'll see that there's not a single point on this line where there is no fear and grief. It's present everywhere. Attachment is there. So at this point where the five has passed away, you experience grief. And then again here, there's fear. And then again here, there's grief. And then again here, there's fear. And then again here, there's grief. Right? Now, I'm going to draw a separate line, a separate graph, just jotting down the points. So this is the graph. This sine curve is a graph that shows the arising and passing away of the mind, and along with that, the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vijnana. Right? Okay. So what I'm going to do now, if I can get rid of this. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw another line which shows to you on the time axis fear and grief along this journey. Right? So let's start here. So they're both on the same y-axis. So what's happening to the mind? And on the x-axis we have time. So that's the time axis. So I've drawn this, what happens to the mind. So let me now jot down what happens to fear and grief. Let's take here, this point. Here you have grief. Here you have fear. You see what I'm doing here, right? Then again here you have grief. And then here again you have fear. Here you have grief. Again here you have fear. And then again grief. Right? Now, is this a sine curve? If I were to now draw a single line to join these dots, what does that look like? Well, let's draw the line and see what it looks like. It looks something like this. But this line, the line above, which is the 5 yes, that has an arising and passing away. That's why it's a sine curve. But in a mind or in a chitta which is tainted with attachment, fear and grief arise, and that fear and grief, if we are to plot on a graph as I have just done here, those dots fall on a straight line. They're not on a sine curve. So, in other words, what I mean is, you will have a point in time in the chitta where you don't see the presence of the five because it has passed away. But you're not going to experience a point on the chitta or in the mind where you're going to be free of both fear and grief. Either fear or grief, either one of them is always present. Either fear or grief. So they take turns, you'll see here. They take turns and one of them is always present. Whilst the five arise and pass away, fear and grief, they take turns to always be present in the mind. Now that should tell you an important thing. There's an important point to take from here. Forever long there is attachment. There's always going to be suffering. Why? Because either you have the fear of having something, so you have the what if suffering. That's the what if, right? That's the fear. What if something happens to it? What if someone takes it? What if it breaks? What if it falls down? What if it burns? This is the what if. And then you have the but alas. So that's when something has happened. That's the grief. So these two things, they continue to represent themselves on this line. What I'm trying to point out to you here is, for as long as attachment taints the mind, there is never a point. You can't point you can't point your finger at a single point on this line to say, here's a time when the mind is free from suffering, because either in the shape of fear or in the shape of grief, they're here to stay. What that should tell you then is, there is no rest, there is no peace, there is no happiness for a mind that is tainted with attachment. Although the five arise and pass away, do you see suffering arising and passing away? Let me ask the question again. You need to pay full attention now, because this is an important point. I'm trying to bring all the things we've spoken about in the past, bring it all together and tie it all up so that it looks nice and neat for you. So you can finally start to make sense of all this. Right, so right now you are regurgitating the cud and making sense of all of it. This is when it's going to start to taste nice. Right? The five arise and pass away. So in the mind, there will be times when the five is not present. What times are they? The times when they have passed away. When it arises, it's present. When it's passed away, it's not present. That's why you call it passed away. Like when someone passes away. Right? When a man passes away, he's no longer present. Right? That's passing away. The same happens to the five, arising and passing away. Now, although the five arise and pass away in the mind, can you say the same of suffering? Do you see suffering arising and passing away? Let's take one chitta for example. Right? This is chitta 1. This is chitta number 2. This is chitta number 3, and so on. Okay? So the first chitta, in the first chitta, the five, this Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana, this is the moment it arose. Right? So during this period, this is the time of arising. So it's arising during this period. During this period, it's passing away. Make sense? So it's fading in and it's fading out. So the moment it hits the trough, it's passed away. At its peak, that is when it's at its that is when it's at its peak. So it's faded in, and at this moment it's faded out. So you see, the mind will be at points in time be void of the five. There'll be points in time in the mind where you see the presence of the five. There'll be other points in the mind where you will not witness the five. Now, does that make sense to everyone? There are points in time when the mind is able to witness the five, but there are points in time in the mind where it is not able to witness the five. That is because of the arising and the passing away. However, can you say the same? Can you say the same of suffering? Let's examine it. Can you say the same of suffering? Down here, when it was not present, so here's when we started, where time equals 0. Where the five was not present, but attachment was present, you're left with grief. You recall from our previous sermons, we said when attachment exists in the mind, the five will arise and pass away, leaving suffering behind. You'll be able to remember that, okay? And attachment behind. So attachment will remain, but the five will arise and pass away. So, because the five is the result of vipaka, they come into the mind as a result of vipaka. But attachment comes into the mind due to ignorance. You know that now. Attachment is caused by ignorance. That's not ignorance. Ignorance. But Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana, that's not caused by ignorance. That's caused by vipaka. That is why it is also present in the mind of an Arahant. But attachment is not present in the mind of an Arahant because it's caused by ignorance. So, for as long as ignorance is present, attachment is present, and for as long as attachment is present, suffering is present. Therefore, when the five is not present in the mind, you have grief, which is the point I have indicated here. So I'm going to just mark a little G here. And then after the point of arrival, so this is the point of its peak, you have fear. Then it's passed away. Now you have grief again. Then it's arised. It has arisen, and then you have fear. Passed away, grief. It's arisen again, fear. Passed away, grief. And you see. Now this is a straight line. There's not a point on this line where you can say there is no suffering. So, while the five arise and pass away, suffering has continued to exist throughout the span of time. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, if it doesn't, I want you to go back and listen to this before I continue on to the next segment. Okay? So either you do it right now during the live sermon, or you can either at the end of this sermon when you go back and listen to it. What I have explained to you up until this point, make sure it's clear in your minds before you listen to the next part of this sermon. So, in the live sermon, it's fine, you can stay on and continue to listen to what I'm talking to you about. But when you're going for the repeat, get this bit clear first. Stop at this point, go back and watch it a few times and get that bit clear. The stuff that I drew on the board, get that bit clear first before you listen to the next portion of what I'm going to be talking about. Right? Okay. So So very quickly again, the sine curve represents the path of the mind. So the chittas arising and passing away. You have 3 chittas on board here, as you can see. There were countless before and there will be countless after, unless you hit the state of parinibbana. The 5 Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana, which come into the mind through the 5 senses or 6 senses, they arise in the mind and they pass away in the mind. For as long as there is attachment, which is not something that is present in the mind of an Arahant. So we cannot be talking here forward about the mind of an Arahant. The arising and passing away is the only thing that happens in the mind of an Arahant, along with the chitta, the 5. But if we are talking about someone who's not an Arahant, so that's basically me, you have fear and grief. Grief is something we experience when we don't have what we want. That's the alas. It's a sorrow. Right? The other term we use for grief is sorrow. Fear is what we have in mind when we have something we want. Not when we have something. When we have something we want. Grief is what we have what we experience when we don't have something we want. Without the we want, that sentence is not accurate and complete. Because after all, it's attachment that creates wanting and therefore suffering. So grief is present when it's not present. Fear is present when it has a reason. So when the 5 is present. When the 5 has passed away again, there's grief. When the 5 has arisen again, there's fear, grief, fear, grief, fear, grief, fear. You get the story. Now here's another very important point. Although this arises and passes away, that's arising and passing away, is that characteristic present in this line of suffering? The Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana appear to be arising and passing away, but this line of suffering, does that seem to be arising and passing away, or is that a steady line? You know the answer. That's a steady line. It doesn't seem to be arising and passing away. It seems to be fixed. Right? The above seems to be arising and passing away, but this seems to be fixed. The above seems to be changing all the time, but this seems to be fixed. There's no change, so this is static. And the above line, at every point in this line, the inclination of the 5 is to fade out. Even when it's fading in, the fate of this is to fade away, to fade out, right? So, when a boy is 5 years old, do you not know that he is 5 years closer to his death? Right? So your date of birth, or rather your age, can either be seen as the time you have lived since your birth, or the time you have moved closer to your death. Right? You can interpret your age in both those senses. Either the time you have lived since birth, or the time you have the time you have moved closer to your death. So, if you take the context of, the interpretation of the time you have moved closer to your death by, then any point on this line, the 5 are moving towards their death, or towards passing away. Therefore, would it not be right to say that the 5 are inclined to passing away? To decay and death. That is what the 5 is inclined to. However, this line of suffering shows no inclination towards a sad fate. It does not show an inclination towards a death. It's a very static, steady, fixed, and one that does not show any signs of aging or death. Right? So this has a characteristic of something that is permanent. It seems to be forever present. These characteristics, so the fact that it's steady, there's no change. I don't mean the change from grief to fear, from fear to grief. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about collectively they are called suffering, right? So this is also suffering, this is also suffering, this is also suffering. You get the idea. So it's all suffering, you just different terms for suffering. So the suffering is steady. The suffering is fixed. It's not changing. It's not arising or passing away. It's steady, it's fixed. It's static. It's not in a state of constant flux. Like I said, on this curve, on the above curve, or the curve above, the sine curve, at t equals 1, what was present at the moment before changed so that what is present now can manifest. What is present now has to change so that what is going to be present in the next moment can manifest. So it's in a state of constant flux. However, the bottom line is not in a state of constant flux, it's permanent. So do you see then that the bottom line, the characteristics of the bottom line, which is the nature of steadiness, being fixed, being static, being permanent, are the complete opposites of the above. Now let's go back to that activity I asked you to do a while ago. I asked you to close your eyes and go back to your childhood, to go back to your most distant memory. And you said, I was there when I was younger. At age 6, that was me. And these things happened to me when I was 6 years of age. Then you said, when I was 16 years of age, these things happened to me. Then you said, when I was 26 years of age, these things happened to me. Then you're saying, at the age of 36, which is what I'm now, these things are happening to me. Then you say, at the age of 46, these things will happen to me. At 56, these things will happen to me. At the age of 86, these things will happen to me. Right? So the some things keep changing while the some one remains static. The some things keep moving towards the observer, the Sam, the baby Natasha, the you, the me, the self, this ever-presence that always remained. Steady, fixed, static and permanent. Now can you see on both something that is steady, fixed, static and permanent? What is that? Is it the Rupa? Is it Vedana? Is it Sanya, Sankhara or Vijnana? Or is it the mind or the Chitta that carries them? Which one of the above? Hopefully you've got the answer. That is none of the above. The one thing that can remain steady, fixed, static and permanent is suffering. Either in the shape of grief or in the shape of fear. So either in the form of grief or in the form of fear, suffering has always remained. Now, in that activity that you just did a while ago, perhaps you did it just right now as I was saying it to you, you sensed that there was a someone that was present throughout this story. Even right now you feel that you are listening to this sermon. You listened to the sermon last week. You're planning on listening to the sermon next week. So there's a someone who's going through some things. Can you see now distinctly? There are these two things on screen. These are the some things. And here's your someone. So what is someone after all? You thought that it was you. That's why I said you are not who you think you are. You never thought that you were suffering. You never thought that you were a problem. That's why I said, have you ever walked up to someone and said, I feel me, I am I, that's a problem? Have you complained about yourself? You've always complained about the some things. You've said, I want to see the beach, but my parents won't take me. So you complained about the some things. You complained that the some things weren't lined up according to your likes, to your wishes and your wants. You never realized that the someone was the problem. In fact, there's nothing wrong with something. Because something never brought suffering. What you sense as someone is actually suffering personified. You have given life to suffering. In other words, you is suffering brought to life. I is suffering brought to life. The self is suffering brought to life. It should be very clear to you now through what you're seeing on screen here. You see, there's nothing else that is steady. There's nothing else that is fixed, static or permanent. In a world that is arising and passing away constantly, it's not like during one cycle of these chittas, it's fixed. That's not the case. In fact, if you were to zoom into this, I don't know if you can zoom in. Let's try that. Oh yes, you can. So imagine I were to zoom into this. What's really happening is a lot of these. That didn't work. What's really happening is a lot of these. So each of these points is arising and passing away. When you take it at a macro scale, the chitta is arising and passing away. Yes, that is true. But when you go microscopic, each point is arising and passing away. No matter how much you zoom in, each point is arising and passing away, because each of these points on the path of the chitta is the result of causes, and all causes arise and pass away. Much like this journey that you took from one place to another, each point on this map or each point on this path is distance that you traveled, right? If someone asked you, where did you go? You'll say, I went to Colombo. But did you not go to a mile from Kandy first before you got to Colombo? If you left from Kandy to head to Colombo, did you not get to a mile from Kandy before you went to Colombo? Of course, the answer is yes. Okay, did you not get to half a mile from Kandy before you get to Colombo? What about 3/4 of a mile? What about 100 meters? What about 10 meters? What about 5 meters? What about a meter? Okay, what about 10 centimeters? You get the idea, right? Each of these points on the journey was distance that you traveled. You can go as fine as you like. Is distance you traveled. The totality of that is your journey from Kandy to Colombo. Now likewise, the same story applies here. So what I've drawn here, for you to understand and visualize, is excuse me. Each of these excuse me. Each of these points on the path of this chitta are points which arose due to causes, and when those causes cease to exist, as the causes pass away, the result, which is the point that has manifested at each individual point, as the causes pass away there, the result, which is the manifestation of the chitta at that point, will pass away. Now, this is what I said about fear and grief. You see, that being the case, at a microscopic level, if grief is present at the troughs and fear is present at the peaks, do you not see peaks and troughs at every single point on this line? So would it not be fair then for me to say that at each point of this on this line, so imagine these are dotted lines, I'm just drawing them as straight lines to, otherwise it's going to be very difficult to draw dotted lines here, but what I want you to understand is that each point on this curve, if you were to plot on the suffering graph, you're going to get grief, fear, grief, fear, grief, fear, grief, fear, and so on. So really, if I were to plot grief and fear on this line, you're going to see something like this. Each of these dots is suffering, either in the shape of fear or in the shape of grief. And it's in its very simplest sense, right? Suffering comes in lots of different names, right? Sorrow and lamentation and all that, right? We don't need to go into that depth for the time being. But each of these dots at a microscopic level is fear and grief. So, do you not see now that there seems to be a non-changing, permanent, static, fixed and steady entity? See, fear and grief never passed away. Fear and grief together we call suffering. So suffering never passed away. Suffering was always there. Since when? What is the cause of suffering? Attachment. So, since attachment tainted the mind, suffering has always been there. When did attachment taint your mind? Day before? I'm just kidding. Attachment tainted your mind the day ignorance entered your mind. When was that? since the beginning of samsara. So, let alone your most distant memory from your childhood, you have come all this time in samsara, experiencing the presence of an ever existing, permanent, static, fixed and steady entity. That entity, I'm sorry to let you know, is not you, it's not I, it's not me or self, it's not a someone, it's not a who on the chair, it's actually, lo and behold, it's suffering. It is suffering that you have experienced throughout samsara. So what you feel as being present, that feeling of I am here, that is really fear and grief that you are experiencing right now. This may be a little bit heavy. Actually, this may be quite heavy, a lot heavy, very heavy. I understand that. As I said, I'm talking to you things that I have been contemplating on for weeks. And every day that passes by in the week, this is what I am contemplating on and trying to rid all causes that lead to suffering in my mind. Amidst a mundane life, this may be particularly difficult for you to understand, but that is no excuse to give up. What's important is you go back and watch this again. So this is not one of those sermons you can just get the MP3 and listen to it while you are doing something else. It won't work like that. You will need to follow the diagrams on screen along with the voice. Otherwise, you're going to struggle to understand this. Right? We will continue to talk about this. We'll elaborate on this in future sermons. We've got to start somewhere. Just because something's difficult doesn't mean we should never do it. Can you name one thing that you gave up because it was too difficult? Is that why you have become successful people that you are? Whenever there was a challenge, you accepted it, you worked on it, and then you overcame it. Let's go through this one last time before we conclude the sermon. Right? And I think I'll leave you with that, enough to contemplate on for a week at least. And if you know what's best for you, I think you should probably go back and watch this, at least the second half of this, at least 4 or 5 times over to get your heads around. Every time you listen to it, you will understand it better. Okay? I'm going to skip over I'm going to go over the stuff you already know as quickly as I can. We started talking about the world and the 5 senses through which we experience it. You know your usual 5 sense organs: eyes, ear, nose, tongue and body. And then you of course have your mind, which can feed itself. So the mind remains self-sufficient at all times. Sight, sound, smell, taste and touch come through your 5 senses into the mind, and these are your visitors to your mind. The mental objects. So the mental objects: Rupa Rupa, Shabda Rupa, Gandha Rupa, Rasa Rupa, Sparsha Rupa, Dhamma Rupa. But generally we use the common term Rupa. Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana. That is, we have stuff we have talked about in the past. All I did today was to remind you and perhaps gave you a little bit more depth and gave you a few analogies so that you can make more sense of it. Then we moved on and reminded ourselves about this sine curve, which represented the arising and passing away of the mind or the chitta and whatever gets dropped onto the chitta. So like a merry-go-round which carries its passengers round the wheel, the passengers have no choice but to go in the direction of the wheel. You can't sit on a merry-go-round that's turning clockwise and expect to go anti-clockwise. It doesn't work like that. So because the chittas arise and pass away, the five which get dropped, what do I mean by five? You know, that's the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana, which hereafter I will refer to as the five. The five that get dropped onto the chittas arise and pass away along with it. This can in no way bring us suffering. What is our evidence of that? The great Arahants. Arahants go through this experience in just the same way. They all have their five sense organs. None of them lost them the moment they became Arahants. They all had their five sense organs. So that is not an obstacle to one becoming an Arahant. So the five that came in through their five sense organs into their mind also arose and passed away along with their chittas. So in this graph that you see on screen, the graph on the top, which is the sine curve, that is present in the mind of an Arahant. No difference there. I have shown three chittas there, 1, 2 and 3 as I have labeled them. And on the peaks and troughs of each of those curves, I have plotted a point. So it's a little dot. You can see there's one here, there's one here, there's one here, here, there's one here, there's one here, and there's one here. Right? These are important points on the graph, particularly points of particular importance, because these points at a high level represent what has happened to the five that dropped onto the mind. At this point, it hasn't dropped yet. Therefore, for someone who is attached to the five, what happens when you're attached to something and you don't have it? What is your state of mind then? Of course, the mind is in grief. Like when you have lost someone you love, or you lost something you love, or you like, right? That's a state. The state of mind is grief. So at this point on the curve, the five is not present. However, the attachment to the five, which is the longing for it, the yearning for it, the wanting for it, that remains. Therefore, grief is evident at this point on the graph. As we move forward, the five gets dropped onto the mind, and then you have the five present on the mind. However, because of attachment, what happens to the mind when you have something and you're attached to it? Remember, we've spoken about this in very practical examples in the past, like why do you check your phone in your pocket as you get off the bus if, for instance, you've fallen asleep? You have it, but you are fearful of it. How do you feel about your beloved son, your daughter, after you send them out until they get back home? You haven't lost them. You only fear something you have. So the same applies in the case of the chitta. At this point in time, the chitta has the five, and therefore there's fear present as a result of attachment. And then the story continues. As it passes away, it leaves the mind again void of the five, but the mind, due to ignorance, is still attached to it and still wanting it. Therefore there's suffering. That suffering again is called grief. And then it arises again, and then fear, and then grief, and then fear, and then grief. The same principle over time is just fear, grief, fear, grief, fear, grief, fear, grief, and so on. What we did then was to actually plot those points on the graph. We mirrored them onto a line, so we kind of extracted the grief and fear from the points on the graph, and we plotted them on a line, and actually what we got was a straight line. right? So there's grief and there's fear. Now when you plot those individual points, you get a straight line. Now that line is, on that line you don't see anything that is arising and passing away. You don't see anything that is changing. You don't see anything that is in a state of flux. You don't see anything that is impermanent. What you're seeing is something that is steady, fixed, static, and has a nature of permanence. Much akin to the feeling of a self that you have always had. You may not recall your previous births, but you will remember from your most distant memory to today and to your future, you feel that it was I to whom those things happened in the past. It is I to whom these things are happening in the present, and it is to I these things will happen in the future. So although along with time the some things changed, the someone remained the same. People who have no understanding of the Dhamma will always complain about the something. They'll say, I don't have ice cream, please go get me some ice cream. What are they complaining about? Someone or something? Of course they're complaining about something, because ice cream comes through the outside, from the outside. Through eye, the ear, nose, tongue and body. So these four organs will bring ice cream to the mind in the shape of Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana, which arise and pass away. So now they're complaining about something. I don't have ice cream, please bring me ice cream. When it passes away again, they're complaining about it. When they have it again, they're complaining about it. Don't you even think about touching my ice cream, that's my ice cream. And when it passes away, why did you eat my ice cream? And then when it rises, don't you take my ice cream, that's my ice cream. So has anyone ever enjoyed ice cream? They cannot, because there's always going to be suffering in the shape of either fear or grief. That is because they're always complaining about something. They never thought the problem was with someone. Now let me take you back to that ascetic who went to the Buddha. Those people, they felt that there was always an I that was present. They felt a self. So they went looking for the self. They had heard about the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara and Vijnana, the Panchaskandha, the five aggregates, from the teachings of the previous Buddhas. They couldn't figure out that the self was suffering, because had they done so, then they would have been Buddhas. What they thought was that what they sensed, that mental itch, that ever-presence, that I am, the me, the self, they thought that was a product of Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara and Vijnana. Therefore they went to the Buddha asking some questions. They went and asked him, Venerable Sir, Venerable Gautama, is the self in the Rupa? Is it in the Vedana? Is the Rupa made out of the self? Or is the self made out of Rupa? Or is the Rupa the self? These are the questions that they asked. And the same they asked across Vedana, Sanya, Sankara and Vijnana. That's where you had the Visadivida Sakkaya Ditthi. They asked about the self. Is the self in the Rupa? Or is the Rupa in the self? Is the self made up of the Rupa? Or is the Rupa made out of the self? So you have four questions there, right? Is the self in the Rupa? Is the Rupa in the self? Is the self made up of the Rupa? Or is the Rupa made out of the self? So that's 4 times 5, you get your tentry. That's your Visadivida Sakkaya Ditthi. The 20-fold wrong views that they held on to. Hence they went to the Buddha asking, where do I find the self in these things, in the 5 aggregates? To which the Buddha's answer was, see, this is why I said back then, the Buddha gave the perfect answer, of course. He gave the perfect answer. You should not be asking, whether in the Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara or Vijnana the self is. That's not because he didn't know that it was not in the self. So it was not in the Rupa. The problem was, had he given that answer, had he said, "Oh Brahmin, my dear man, it's not in the Rupa, it's not in the Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana," had he said that, what do you think the Brahmin would have done? He would have stood and he would have walked away. He would have missed his opportunity to attain enlightenment. Remember, the Buddha is the Pabhasakarasa. He is the enlightener. He does not let go anyone who has the opportunity, who has the merit, the power to become enlightened. So he is the enlightener. Therefore, when someone walks up to him with even a modicum of opportunity and merit to achieve enlightenment, that's why I said, remember, do not ask the Buddha that one question in case you want to become a Brahma or a Sakadeva. There's one question you shouldn't be asking him. Where is the self? Is it in the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana? Once you've asked that question, you're doomed. Yes, you are doomed. You, that is suffering, that is doomed. So if you ever come across the Buddha and you want to remain in samsara, just don't ask that question. So when they asked that question, the Buddha said, "You are asking the wrong question, young man." So then the Brahmin asked, "Okay, in which case, what is the question I should be asking?" To which the Buddha's response was, "Don't ask me whether it's in the Rupa. Ask me, how does it come into being? How does this self that I feel, that I feel is present, how does it come into being?" That is the question you ought to be asking me. And you know what happened after that. So the Brahmin asked that question, and then he continued along the line. Remember, what they went and asked was, what is the jati? Where is the jati? Where is the self? This is the same thing. Where is the self? Where is the I? You know, in the dependent origination process, the last stage is jati, before suffering. Or before jara marana, decay and death, right? So this is what they were asking. Where is the jati? Is it in the Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankara, Vijnana? And the Buddha said, don't ask me that question. You're asking the wrong question. Ask me, how did it come into being? So the Buddha led this Brahmin through a series of questions up until he got to that final answer. Ignorance is the cause of abhisankara. Now, as I explained to you in the past, the moment he was informed that it was ignorance, anyone with any level of intelligence that is enough to be sat in front of the Buddha will figure out that this self that I am feeling, the Buddha is telling me, is a result of ignorance. So therefore it cannot be true. It has to be fake. Excuse me. If something is the result of ignorance, what is ignorance after all? Sensing something that does not exist. We spoke about this also in the past in one of the sermons. I left you with a riddle. What seems to exist does not exist. What exists does not. What does not exist, or what seems to not exist, exists. Right. So this man, he thought the self existed, but what really exists is suffering. I think the way we phrased it was, what you see does not exist. What exists you do not see. I think that was the riddle. Because if he sees suffering, then the self, or the presence of a self, or the notion of a self ceases to exist along with that. It is because he has not yet seen suffering, he sees that a self exists. Right? So what you see does not exist. So he is seeing the self. That does not exist. What exists, you do not see. So what really exists then? Suffering exists. That he has not yet seen. Why? Because he is still blindfolded. Why? Because he has not yet stood on the path. He is still blindfolded. So that is jati. Ignorance is the cause of jati, the ultimate cause of jati, or rather the root cause of jati. So having understood that, now the man begins to wonder, hang on, ignorance, as I said, you remember, that was the worst insult you could make on a Brahmin back in the day. You're ignorant. You could have called them ugly and they wouldn't have minded. But tell a Brahmin back in the day that they're ignorant, it's like calling someone ugly these days. Nowadays you call someone ignorant, they'll say, so, that's the way we rock and roll. Say someone you're ugly, they'll probably come knocking on your door with, they're going to bring trouble to you. But back in those days, when people were not deep down their knees in sensual, in the cesspit of sensual desires, people were more interested in their salvation. So what they did was they went looking for the self. They were soul seekers. The Buddha was a truth seeker. King Satya Gavesi. He went looking for the truth, whereas those Brahmins went looking for the Atma, or the soul. They were soul seekers. When the soul seeker sat in front of the truth seeker, who won that battle? You know the answer. So he said, ignorance is the cause of this self. Excuse me. So having realized that, then the Brahmin asks the question, what I'm doing right now, folks, is I'm bringing all those previous sermons and showing you that I've been talking about the same thing all along, but building you up step by step to get to this point. If this doesn't make sense, you've got to go back and listen to the old sermons. If this does make sense, you still got to go back and listen to the old sermons, so that you can, once you've gone through this a few times, it will really start making a whole lot of sense to you. The first go may be a little bit challenging. So he then figures out this is ignorance. So if this is ignorance, what is the truth, Venerable Gautama? And then he brings the Brahmin back through the dependent origination process. Remember when we talked about the dependent origination process, when I first started to talk to you about that, what did I say? The dependent origination of what? I told you that this is the dependent origination of something. What was that? It was a dependent origination of suffering. So that's exactly what I'm trying to say again here, in different words. Avidya pacchaya sankara vijnana nama rupa salayatana, and finally you get to jati. Jati pacchaya jara marana, shoka parideva, dukkha domanassa, eva metasya kevalassa, dukkha khandassa samudaya hote. This fellow man is, well, he never referred to anyone as a fellow because that would have been another Buddha. This young man is the birth of suffering. So what the Buddha is saying is, what you are sensing is not a me, it's not a self, it's not an I. What you are sensing is suffering. So hopefully you can see the connection to those what I've been talking to you back then, along with what we have just talked about here. Remember the Four Noble Truths. That's another sermon that we did. I told you that the truth has to be proposed to when there's a false. To prove that something is false is when you need the truth. Right? So what is the false then? The falsehood is that this is a self. What I'm feeling like an ever present entity. This that I feel is ever present, ever existing, that is a self, that is the false. That is a falsehood. So what is the truth then? Idam dukkham arya satcham. In the Buddha's words, Pubbhe ananasutesu dhammesu chakkung udapadi. That's the first noble truth, which he talks about in the Dhammsak Pelpun Sutra, the first sermon that he gave on becoming the Buddha in the presence of the five ascetics. So he says, this is not a self, this is suffering. Idam dukkham. That's the first truth. Then the second noble truth, idam dukkham, idam dukkha samudaya arya satcham. He goes on to talk about the cause of this suffering, and he says this is attachment is the cause of this suffering. So you can see clearly on this graph then, attachment is the cause of tanha, of the cause of shoka and bhaya, which is grief and fear. So if it's fear and grief that is always present here, then that is what you feel as that is what you perceive as a self. It's fear and grief. That is what you sense as a self. Right? And the cause of that is attachment. So then tell me, the moment the mind is rid of attachment, which of these two graphs do you think we can no longer plot? The one on the top or the one below? Indeed, we can no longer plot the graph on the bottom, on the graph on the bottom. Why? Because the moment attachment is rid from the mind, attachment causes suffering. Fear and grief are gone out of the picture. Therefore, let's imagine at this point here, the mind was rid of attachment. So we are talking about the mind of an Arahant. What happens next is, from that point forward, you can no longer plot this graph. You can no longer plot that graph. So don't the five arise and pass away from that point forward? Doesn't the mind arise and pass away? No, that continues. As I said, only the bottom of these two graphs can no longer be plotted from the point attachment has been freed from the mind. So in other words, what are we saying? Only fear and grief are no longer present. Arising and passing away happens, but the mind of an Arahant does not feel an ever-existing entity. Because the only ever-existing entity, if one has ever existed, is that of suffering. That is what you feel as an I, as a self. This is the baby Natasha. This is the someone. This is the Sam. This is that mental itch. This is the who that you were looking for on the chair. That's the fear and grief. Nothing else. So idan dukkha samudayam ariya saccam pubbyananu sutesu dhammesu chakkung udapadi jnanam udapadi panya udapadi vidya udapadi aloka udapadi. And then he goes on to say, once you have ceased attachment, suffering is ceased. Right? This is the path to the cessation of suffering, the noble eightfold path. The noble eightfold path, which starts with what? Starts with Samma Ditti. In other words, this ignorance and attachment which is sung has to be gotten rid of, in order for one to attain enlightenment. That is the view, Samma Ditti. So once you have entered Samma Ditti, from that point forward you realize that this has always been the problem. The someone, the presence of a someone, and the cause of that has always been ignorance and attachment. That is when the blindfold comes off. Now you no longer need anyone to cheer you on. Now you no longer need anyone to say left, left, right, right, turn around, upside down. You don't need anyone to say that. Now you know exactly what you need to do. Now you realize that someone is the problem, not something. Some things are innocent. Actually, what I mean by that is all some things are innocent. So all things are innocent, not just some things. All things are innocent. The someone is the problem. And you'll also have come across various other teachings of the Buddha. He talks about rupa, rupam bhikkhave anicca, yadaniccan tan dukkam, yan dukkam tadanatta. Right? Rupam bhikkhave anicca. Rupa, monks, I say, has the nature of arising and passing away. They have the nature of arising and passing away. That is what is meant by anicca there. If it has the nature of arising and passing away, it does not have the ability to create something that is steady. How can something that has the nature of arising and passing away create something that is steady and permanent? It's arising and passing away. In that very description, it says it's arising and passing away. It is not something that is steady. So, that being the case with Rupa, what he means by this is what you're sensing. What this is suffering. That's why he says, Rupam bhikkhve anicca yadaniccam tan dukkham. This is suffering. Yan dukkham tadanatta. This being suffering, this cannot be a self. This cannot be a self. So why think of this as a self? That is a wrong view. That's a wrong idea. It's a wrong notion. You're misguided. This is delusion. What you're seeing is an illusion. Right? So all sorts of karmasthanas can be deep. Right? My benefit, of course, is to go back and listen to this. Not once or twice, but several times over. That are still unclear, you can go back. Because you will begin to see them in a new light. What was not clear then will become clear after you look at it from a new lens. And the new lens being what you have just learnt on this sermon, which is where we have brought all those concepts into one cauldron and kind of sort of cooking the whole thing in one pot. But like I said, what I'm showing you here is how to piece all together the parts that you have brought along with you. If you don't have the parts, then I'm sorry, it won't make sense to you. There may be bits in here that it didn't make sense to you because you probably didn't get to listen to those sermons or those segments in those sermons. So then, what must you do? That must be obvious. If I have to say that out loud also, then you're on the wrong sermon. Right? So, I urge you to go back and listen, because from this point forward we'll be making progress along these principles. So if you didn't get this, if you and you don't put the time into understanding these things, then you may not be able to understand things in the future either. But don't worry, if you are doing what I'm asking you to do, then they will make sense. In the next sermons we will detail this. I won't detail it further, but what rather I'll be doing is explaining it further, breaking up, taking segments of this to help you better understand it. So I think if you really put time into understanding this, you will begin to realize that that thing that you felt was never quite right. Something was always not quite right. Something was wrong. You always try to fix it. Try to fix it by using other people's plans, by using borrowed plans. That's why you took in sight, sound, smells, taste and touch. Do you see now that no amount of sight, sound, smells, taste and touch can fix that problem? Because the problem is not in the some things. The problem is in the some one. The only thing that can fix that problem is the Buddha Dhamma. The only plan you ought to be borrowing is the plan from the Buddha. Get a plan from him and then execute that plan. Get a plan from anyone else and you'll be stuffed. That's the truth. I know this because I was executing all sorts of plans. And none of those plans brought me any amount of satisfaction or fulfillment, because in each of those plans, they always talked about changing the something. Yes or no? Look at all your plans. Did they all not talk about changing some things? Did any of them talk about someone and how to fix that problem? Did any of them talk about ridding attachment from the mind and how ignorance leads to attachment? And ignorance in itself is to take the Rupa Vedana Sanya Sankara Vijnana as being pleasurable. What did you go looking for? You went looking for Rupa, when what you need to understand is that attachment to Rupa is ignorance in itself. So you did exactly the opposite of what you needed to be doing. That's why the way of the world and the way of the Buddhas are 180 degrees apart from each other. Okay, so I'll leave you with that. Plenty for you to ponder over. And if you are kind to yourself, I think you will put some time into going back and listening to this sermon at least a few times. One of the things I want to do in I want to start to do in our future sermons is to really bring to life for you the stories of those who have followed this path, who have not only set foot on the path but who have walked the path and completed the journey. I want to bring you the lives of those great elders, be those men or women, the great arahants, the great Arahat Mehenin Vahanses. Because what I want you to understand, folks, is partly because when you start to listen to the profound parts of the Dhamma, this is only going to be, if it's difficult for you, it's only going to be difficult for you because it's the first time you've listened to this. After you get your head around it, after you listen to it a few times, after you started practicing it, and you do the things that we've been asking you to do, like worshipping your parents. How does worshipping my parents relate to this Swaminathan? Exactly. You got to do it, then you realize how it's related to it. If you don't do it, you're not going to understand it. Like being kind to others, like carrying your voice recorder around with you, recording your voice and trying to work out what are the things that come out of your mouth, right? Like making sure that you do your 15 minutes every day. Remember, all this is a plan. This is the plan I borrowed from the Buddha, and I'm sharing it with you. So you got to do these things. This is a plan that was borrowed by the great Arahants. This is how they became Arahants. This is how I will become an Arahant one day. This is how you will become an Arahant one day. But you got to follow the steps on the plan. Okay? So, what I was going to say was, when you begin to listen to some of these concepts, you may feel a little bit overwhelmed, but you don't need to be. If I can do this, you can do this. If I get this, you get this. Because there's no who here. It's a how. That's all there is. The more you listen to it, the more you practice it, the more you focus on this, the more you'll understand it. The more you're kind, the more merits you perform, the more you practice giving up. Right? If you're a good husband, the better a husband you are, the easier this will make sense to you. Believe you me, folks. That is the way it works. The better a son or daughter you are to your parents, the more kind and gentle you are, the nicer you are, the more you will understand this. Without becoming a Sudumanusya, you're not going to get this. That has to happen first. You've got to be of pure heart before you are able to free your mind of taints. Right? So, I want you to have a role model in your life. People who have walked the path and who have achieved the ultimate success, the ultimate contentment and fulfillment. Some names will ring in your minds louder than others. The great elder Sariputta, the great elder Moggallana, the great elder Mahakashyapa. The great elder nun Bhadrakachayana, Hisagotami, and so on. These figures were people just like you at some point on their journey in samsara. Just like you, they put their first foot on the path at some point in the past. Just like you, they had to listen to the sermons. Just like you, they had to practice. Just like you, they had to become kind and nice and generous people. Just like you, they had to practice saying thank you and please. Just like you, they had to give others the first place and take a rear seat. So you need to have a role model, someone who's walked the path like you. So therefore, when you look at them, you know that if they could do it, I can do it. I promised you a long time ago that we'll bring that segment into our sermons to talk to you about the life stories of the great elders and the great elder nuns. And I think it's probably time to start doing that. So in the next upcoming sermons, we will have a segment. It'll probably either be myself or Dasahandru who will be doing that part of the sermon, and we'll talk to you about the lives of those great elders, and particularly for our young listeners as well as our elderly listeners. So really, it's both. Whether you're young or old, we must understand that mentally we are still babies. Your physical age has nothing to do with your place or your position on the noble path. It's your mental aptitude, your mental maturity, that has more to do with it than your physical age, right? So I want to bring those stories to you, not because they're just nice stories to listen to. I want you to find a role model, and one day I'll ask you who your role model is. You need to study that role model. If it's Dasahandru who does that segment in the sermons, you'll have to listen to those stories, and then you'll have to go and find out about them yourself. So if it's, say, you listen to the Venerable Sariputta and his story, you'll then have to go and find out about him yourself. You have access to various resources. You can read in books, go on the internet, find out about them, and take yourself as close to those characters as much as you possibly can. That is what having a role model is. You model your role according to them. You model yourself according to those figures. You got to be like them. You got to talk like them. You got to walk like them. You got to think like them. That is the purpose of that segment. So you mustn't take it lightly. There's an important reason and purpose why I want to start doing that. There's a lot of weight and there's a lot of effort that goes into it, because unlike the Dhamma, where I don't have to come up with a plan, I can just sit down and start talking to you. When it comes to the stories of those great people, they are historical events. So they are factually either right or wrong, and there's an element of study that we have to do to bring those stories out of the books and that we have available to us and to you in a way that you can relate to them. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. So I want you all to make the most of it. Make sure that your children have a role model, not Spider-Man and Batman. That does not mean you need to now walk into their bedrooms and start tearing out the posters of Batman and Spider-Man and Iron Man that they have hung on the walls. That's not what you need to do. Introduce the great elders to them so that they will do it on their own accord. You don't have to do that. Help them realize that flying in the skies is no big deal. Birds and bats and bees can do that. But in the face of the vicissitudes, when someone's shouting at someone, when someone's taken away everything that belongs to someone, to remain unruffled, to remain unshaken. Show me Batman doing that, and I will forever be his disciple. Right? So these are the role models that we need to have in our lives, folks. If that is where we want to get to, if we want to go for contentment and ultimate bliss, we need to have a role model who has achieved that. They will be our fathers. They will be those who guide us. They may not be among the living today, but the tale they left behind, the legacy they left behind, that is very much still alive. And we will do everything we can to bring it alive for you as much as possible, using whatever medium that is available to us, either that is in person, face to face, or using our online channels that we do for the time being. So that is a promise to you. It will come in our future sermons. Be ready for that, and you got to listen to them with the intention of finding a role model. So to do that, you have to listen to all the stories before you find a role model, right? And then once you found a role model, that becomes the one you want to become. And then focus your life towards reaching that pinnacle of success. Okay? Right. So let us conclude today's sermon on that point then. And one last ask is, go back and listen to this sermon again. It will serve you well. Okay, let us take a moment then to transfer the merits we have acquired today before we conclude today's sermon. First and foremost, let us transfer the merits we have all acquired by making offerings to the infinite virtues of the Noble Triple Gem. Making offerings to the Buddha, Dhamma, the Sangha, listening to the Dhamma, engaging in various meritorious deeds, to all those who are deserving of those merits. First and foremost, let us remind ourselves how incredibly fortunate we are to be in receipt of the Lord Buddha's teaching. With immense gratitude, let us transfer these merits to the bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, upasikas and upasikas, who since time immemorial have protected and preserved the sublime teachings of the Buddha, and have passed it down through the generations of the noble lineage in the form of the Tripitaka, which is thankfully available to us today to study, understand and comprehend the Dhamma. Let us also transfer the merits we have acquired to all members of the Mahasangha present throughout the world, including the chief prelates of all the chapters, who have dedicated and continue to do so their lives to the noble path and have committed themselves towards the betterment of all sentient beings, including you and I. Let us not forget that among them are the monks and nuns resident in your local temples and nunneries, who have always been by your side through thick and thin, come rain or shine. Let us transfer these merits to Guru Swami Mahanse and all other monks residents at this monastery, as well as the Anagarikas and Anagarikas attached to the monastery. Let us also take a moment to transfer these merits and express our deepest gratitudes to those who make great efforts selflessly to disseminate the teachings of the Buddha, be that by transliterating these sermons, sharing them out with others, or perhaps inviting others to join them. And may through the power of these merits, if any of them have been born in the woeful plane, redeem themselves and be born in the blissful plane. May through the power of these merits they abstain from the unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and may they all attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also transfer the merits we have acquired to our devotees, the friends of our monastery, who for the sake of merits continue to sustain the Mahasangha, including those among you who have contributed to the construction of the monastery, to those of you who provide the Mahasangha with shelter, alms, robes and medicines, the four requisites, as well as those who have passed on their know-how and extend their well wishes. May through the power of these merits they abstain from the unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and may they all attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also take a moment to transfer merits to our parents, our spouses, siblings, children, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and various other relations of ours, friends and acquaintances, employers, employees, and to all those who have helped us, supported us, assisted us in any way, shape or form. By the power of these merits, may they be healed of any physical and mental ailments and overcome any obstacles to their spiritual progress. May they abstain from the unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and may they all attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also take a moment to transfer merits to the Devas, Brahma spirits and the demons, primarily the Sakkadeva, as well as all the other numerous gods and deities, who have committed themselves to protecting and fulfilling the Sambuddha Shasana. Let us also transfer merits to our guardian deities, who keep a watchful eye over us and keep us out of harm's way. May through the power of these merits they prosper in divine power and wisdom. May they abstain from the unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and may they all attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Let us also take a moment to transfer merits to our ancestors who have predeceased us, to all those who have been our families, friends and acquaintances in this infinitely long journey that we have come in samsara, those who have helped us, supported us, assisted us in every way and shape they could. Let us transfer these merits to all of them. Let us transfer these merits to the members of the armed forces as well as the police force, who have sacrificed their lives and continue to do so to protect the peace and harmony of our nation on many occasions. May all who have lost their lives in the war, be they friend or foe, rejoice in the merits we have acquired today. Let us transfer merits to all those who have lost their lives in the natural calamities such as tsunamis, earthquakes, landslides, pandemics, including the most recent one, reminding ourselves that among them will be those who have been friends and family to us, those who have helped us, supported us, assisted us in this long journey in samsara. Let us, with deep gratitude, take a moment to transfer our merits to them. May through the power of these merits, if any of them have been born in woeful planes, redeem themselves and be born in the blissful plane. May they abstain from the unmeritorious deeds, fulfill the meritorious deeds, fulfill the noble eightfold path, and may they all attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And finally, let us all resolve that may through the power of the blessings of all the merits we have acquired throughout the Nehin Mahansa in this very life and in the era of the Gautama Supreme Buddha itself. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. May the blessings of the Noble Triple Gem be with you all forever. We will now conclude the sermon. May the Noble Triple Gem be with you all.